All right, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining in from. Thanks for joining today. My name is John Miles. I'm a head consultant at Admission Auto, and today I'm going to be walking through 4 active candidates who are going to be looking to apply in this coming round 1. All different backgrounds and a lot to talk about to each. So, and at the end, there'll be time for questions. So probably about 20 minutes for questions, but really going to go through each person one by one and get into sort of what's working and sort of the ingredients of this recipe called the MBA application. So thanks again for joining today. And to start, we're going to basically look at 4 different profiles. In general, we put labels. We have an engineer from Thailand. We have an Indian web developer, Canadian environmental engineer, and an Indian American who's in the energy industry, oil and gas. So with that, I'm going to start today with looking at the engineer from Thailand. So we have PNP here, and PNP, one thing that jumps out right away is, when you look at the admissions folks in terms of how they're initially screening, one of the core buckets out of, let's say, 4 is, can you do the work? So off the initial impression here with the 730 GMAT, the 3.55 GPA, and doing well in a top engineering school, that definitely sort of to them gives them comfort that you can handle sort of the academic rigor. I think when we get into the other 3 components, now this will apply to everyone applying, but generally schools are really looking at you in 4 ways. Can you do the work? So that's the GPA, the GMAT/GRE. The second is the big why. That's the most important, and it's what you'll probably hear me today talk about the most in terms of it being the anchor of your application, the goals. So where are you going short term? What is that long-term goal? Thirdly, it's going to be your demographic. And lastly will be sort of your potential impact as an alumnus. So PNP, one of the things that jumps out right away is the demographic. You're coming from a relatively underrepresented demographic. That's a positive. Part of the challenge that, let's say folks coming from China or India or even parts of the US is that overrepresentation that you're kind of fighting against. So you end up competing within. So PNP right here jumps out to an admissions committee because of that where he's working. Now, in terms of years of work experience, what we've noticed, what I see here is 3.7. That is kind of right in the sweet spot. One thing to note is, and we'll talk about with a couple of applicants later, is there's the 3.7 years that you have, maybe prior to going, and then at matriculation. So you always want to be conscious of that, kind of the number of years you have before and after. So PNP also jumps out in a very strong way in terms of goals, has a pretty good sense of consulting. Now, my particular concern there is what kind of consulting. Consulting is a common goal, PNP, as you know. So we want to really, so you want to kind of start to think about what in your past is setting you up to be a strategy consultant or an operations consultant, and do they speak together? You know what I mean? Now, your long-term goal, where you talked about, and so that a startup, and the thing with your long-term goal is, and for the purposes of here, it's going to be kind of minimal information, I understand, but you want to make sure that long-term goal, you sort of are putting the stake in the ground around something you really care about. What out there in, let's say, cyber that you just noticed needs to be addressed? There's some problem, there's some need, there's some product. You want credibility, guys, with a long-term goal, and gals. You really want to have credibility. It's one thing to say, I want to go start a fintech firm or a VC fund, but it's another thing to say, hey, when I've noticed in my career at doing cybersecurity solutions in Thailand and working with 10 nationalities like you have in 10 companies, I've learned XYZ. You want to ground that goal in something to get them excited about, kind of like, I'm just getting kind of fired up about it now. That's what you want them to feel. Now, in terms of M7 and where your targets are,
Actually, I am for the MIT, but that is the another one specific question that I want to argue, that how can we select the proper school to apply? Yes, how can we select the proper school for applying?
So in terms of sort of how to think about school selection for yourself?
Yes. I already I got some school in my heart. Yes, that actually I want to. I really aim to the MIT. Yes,
Yeah.
but
So,
yes, but
so
I want to see the other opinion. I mean,
yeah,
admission consultant opinion that okay. How will it suit for me? Yeah.
yeah. So I would say that's one of the first schools I was thinking of in my mind. I would say Haas at Berkeley as well would be another one in terms of, let's just, if we're talking about the US for now and sort of M7 there. You know, you're a fit. What you see with MIT often is a lot of people who want to go into consulting or product management if we're looking at kind of cyber or the tech space. So yeah, you would fit that perfectly. I'd say the other thing with Sloan for you would be you know where in your development of cyber solutions that you note, and it kind of really jumps out in your profile and in the longer form that I was reading, where have you shown some innovation, some creativity? When you partnered with 10 companies or 10 nationalities, did you have to get creative? Because Sloan in their kind of DNA or mission has a lot of that, not just business, but sort of creative, you know, mind, creative thinking business. People who aren't afraid to push the status quo or how things are traditionally done. So that's one thing that in your profile jumps out in terms of your past here, which isn't on the slide, but where you talked about some of the designing implementations that you did, you know, and how they were ranked and evaluated. That's an important thing that again supports your goal of management consulting. But the question then becomes, where is it? Is it Accenture? Is it McKinsey? Is it pure strategy? That's one thing you'd really want to be much more detailed on, and you know, in the application, of course.
Yeah. Because yes, actually my long-term goal is run a startup about cybersecurity, but yet I'm absolute a pure engineer who don't know much about finance and business, something like that, and also maybe about marketing, and also I mean the overall about the how to manage some company, you know. That is why I think okay, I want to go to the MBA, and I want to learn about the management, how to manage a company in the long term,
Right.
and make it achieve from the management consulting. That is my short term goal, and yeah,
Yep.
that
So
is the
PMP overall, and before I give the overall kind of summary, I'd say you brought up an important point that is relevant to anyone on this call today and video, is this idea: if you're coming from an engineering or technical background, it's great in terms of, you know, they like the fact that you think a certain way, just like lawyers or may not ever practice law, but they're trained to assess problems, situations, arguments a certain way. So, but when you get towards the application, engineering almost is like it's like a bad word, not a bad word. You want to kind of put that in the background, and you want to show, even if you're a developer, and we'll talk about that shortly, or someone who's really, you know, more technical, where's the business impact been? What quarterly result? Was there an asset retained, or was there a client won? Was there a partnership made? So just if you can tie anything that's technical, it's not bad in and of itself, but it just needs to be blended, because remember, it's a master's in business administration, and that emphasis on business. And a lot of people, when I see people who come to us who didn't get in and they come to us with their old applications, it's often that they're trying to highlight their engineering skills, and that we don't want to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So overall, PMP, I'd say, you know, from an academic goals standpoint, those are the kind of the anchors. Can you do the work? Work experience is solid. Extracurriculars, from what I saw earlier, were solid. I would say, you know, you would be. I of course want to have some safer programs in there, but I wouldn't have an issue with you applying to, you know, some M7 and then maybe spreading the risk out. One thing to note too, if you've only taken the test once with the 730, I definitely recommend giving it one more go, unless you've taken it 4 or 5 times, then I'd say no. But,
so, I got it. Thank you.
Good. Well, with that, you're welcome. And let me move on, and we're going to be moving on to Lei, I believe.
Hello, John.
Yeah. Hey, Lei, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great, thank you. And I'm looking forward. Here we go. So we've got Lei's profile up. We've got Lei is generally a web developer, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, so I guess one thing that jumps out here is, you know, that obviously you haven't taken this test yet. Have you been taking practice tests, or?
Yes, I have been. I've been scoring consistently around 720 or 730.
Good. Okay. One thing to note on practice tests, this has come up a lot over the past maybe 2 years, is that I'm not seeing a massive correlation between how well folks may do on the practice tests and how well they may do in the actual, and it can be in opposite directions. You know, it basically you could be doing really well and then maybe do, and then you may not do well on the practice test and then you end up doing. So just kind of, you want to sort of normalize it, if you will, and think about it more as just a relatively good barometer, but not necessarily like, don't get your confidence too, you know, amped up, and also don't feel like dejected if you're not. It could be because the practice test, maybe they're older. I don't know, but it's just something I've noticed. So one thing that jumps out with you, with target schools, my initial kind of reaction when I do this is I sort of get like, what's my general gut? Your target schools and your goals are quite aligned. I don't know if that was by purpose, but it is. And it's sort of interesting because it gives you, coming from the tough demographic, you sort of are kind of, for the M7s, let's say, or I'd say Haas for sure, you'd want to be around 730. Not that having a 730 for UCLA and Marshall, which are schools that I think are massively moving up, going to be moving up to the rankings. They're very popular now, but you kind of, you sort of are looking at schools that are really a fit to where your sector is going. So Los Angeles and tech, where I recently lived, there's a lot going on there. Seattle is great with that. So right away, I think your goals story, it could really be strong because you're tying sort of the campus and of course the courses, the professors to that product, the PM goal. Now, one thing I had a question of here was what is your long-term goal?
Actually, after becoming a product manager, I want to climb to the C-suite of not the big tech firms, but at least at a tier 2.
Okay. Now, work experience is, you've got financial services experience, but you've got technical experience within that. So let's just call it, financial tech experience, which is great. And the question then becomes, do you see yourself at a large firm, or is it like, hey, I want to go to a pure fintech that recruits from a tepper? That's just something I put in your mind, because I think you can make the claim for both. But the key is, whatever you've been doing at Credit Suisse and what you don't want to depart, you don't want to sort of that needs to be sort of a baseline and a foundation for what you want to do, in that summer internship or wherever. So don't kind of throw that all away. Some of you guys sort of want to maybe switch careers a little bit or transition. That's a kind of a fine line. You want to be sure that your past is really grounding that short-term goal. The long-term goal, you have more flexibility on. So when you say C-suite, just be careful, because a lot of people will kind of throw that in nonchalantly as if it's like, well, I don't know what else to say. So it's better to sort of think, are you CTO? Are you CXO? That kind of thing. And what in your past will prepare, how does a PM role, and of course something in between, prepare you for that? Is it VP of product, that kind of thing?
Yep.
The other thing is, I don't see, being a web developer, one thing on your resume that I saw bits of, just in terms of not the full resume, but just bullet points, is be careful to, like I said before with PMP, make sure you're kind of grounding it in business results, not necessarily quantitative. It doesn't have to be quantitative, but just tying the technical work on like the data or the market or trading system and tying it to sort of the desk and what's going on ultimately.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing, GPA wise, I had a note. So you were about 74%, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So for folks in India who are also listening, and this is for lay too, of course, specifically, but that seems to be what I would say, if I had to put a rough, what's the most common percentage I see from the CGPA in terms of Indian universities, it would be in that sort of mid-7s or so. So I don't see a lot of people in the 80% or above, whether you're at IIT, BITS, or whatever. I don't. So just if that's comforting to anyone, or I do see people in the 60% and above, but I think 70 is sort of where it all pans out. So in that screening, when they're looking at you, it's sort of say, well, how will they differentiate? That's where the test kind of comes in. So I'd say again, if the test goes well, and with your work experience, I mean, you have 4 years at a brand name company. I mean, schools, just so everyone knows, schools do like brand name companies. I would say more so than the brand name university, what I've noticed over the years of doing this. So I think if the test goes well, and you kind of iron out that long-term goal with some more specificity. You target and isolate what kind of companies that are recruiting from these schools you'd like to go to. I would say you'd be competitive for those programs. And I think really what jumps out, as I said from the start, is the fact that you've identified geographies and campuses and locales where the tech component sort of reigns, which is great.
Yeah.
Any
So
questions?
actually, yeah,
Yeah.
I had a question. Uh, in an article like a couple of days ago, I think it was a PNQ article. I read that the class sizes are shrinking for most of these universities.
Mhm.
So does that mean I will have to up my target score, or 740 is a comfortable score for me to be in?
Yeah, good question. I'd say if you get a 740, that'll be your first attempt. I mean, if you got a 740 and you took it, like, let's say in 2 months,
Mhm.
you, now just from my vantage point, taking other factors out, you could probably take it again, let's say. And if you got a 760, that sort of puts you, that starts to really differentiate you. But I'd say even at a 740, given the schools that you've identified, again, these are not weak schools, and I'm not implying that by any means. I'm just kind of separating them from the overflow at Stanford and Harvard and Wharton, all the applications they're going to get. I would be totally comfortable in a round one situation. Round one versus round two, gang, out there, there's much more kind of parity now in terms of the two. I wouldn't say it's critical that it be rushed to round one. I would, maybe a number of years ago, I might have said a little bit more emphasis on it, but maybe because of the pandemic, there's plenty of people just mixing it up across both rounds. It's really just when you get into round three. So again, round one, I'd be comfortable with you with doing that. If you went with the 740, yeah.
Okay.
I think yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, please go.
The GPA thing, that's kind of the weaker spot on a general sense, not necessarily pure demographic sense. So that might be something, a cause for notice from them, but they're going to dive into your transcript. They're going to look at what courses affected what, that kind of thing.
Right. So any schools that you might suggest other than these schools that I've chosen?
Yeah. So there's more I'd have to uncover in terms of your background and profile, but I think you kind of hit up. I mean, Foster was the one I was looking for that I think people often forget, which is, it's a great program. I'd say potentially, I'd throw in Fuqua from a tech component and a tech recruiting component, and I maybe throw in Wharton depending on how the school score went. But I definitely would throw in Fuqua, and just because of where they're now placing folks in terms of tech, all types of tech, where founders are where fundings have come from recently.
Right.
So some of the and I'd say also with Fuqua that one of the because Duke itself has made a concerted effort to really focus on tech in many ways and interdisciplinary work around tech and research around tech. That's why I feel like that'd be a great fit as well. Not just because I went there, by the way. So. And full disclosure to everyone listening, I didn't get in my first year I applied. I had a 610 GMAT. No idea what my goal. I didn't have employment goals. I just was kind of wrote these essays that sounded good but didn't say anything. So I kind of know all about what not to do. But things worked out the next year. But again, there is if you the goals, or the why is so critical. So with that, I'll move on. And Leigh, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that was. Thank you, John.
Great.
Yeah.
So next up, looks like we have Alex, right?
Yep. Hey, John, how are you?
Good, Alex. Thanks for joining. It looks like we got an environmental engineer from Canada, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, so in my notes here, just kind of again, kind of high level. What am I thinking? Having looked at so many of these over the years, you've got a lot of work experience. You're going to have a lot too, even when you start. Now, one thing on that, and you're not there yet, but I just want to note, because this is coming up a lot. And for U.S. business schools, when you kind of get near 30, I went back at 30, so I barely squeaked in. You're kind of becoming risky in terms of that post-employment position. So this is just a general comment that I want to make on age and work experience. That it's not like you can have too much, but you can have too much in terms of if you're not a non-traditional. So let's say you're not a military or let's say Olympic athlete or MBA or professional athlete, whatever. I've seen people like that who can go back at 31 and slot right in. So just something I'll bring up. Right away, Alex, I think you've got, you got a sense your goal of operations consulting sort of ties well with what you've done work-wise. So that, again, I talked about that before. You want to make that connection from the past to where you're going. You don't want to kind of upend things. The green tech piece, that kind of overlay, I think works well too. I think you have a lot of credibility around there. Now you've got an engineering degree. You've got the GPA jumps out as sort of a little bit of a marker. Although you showed improvement with the 3.7 in the last 2 years, that's important. So I'd say that they'll look at that well. You also did well quantitatively on the GMAT with the 48. Just so everyone knows, you don't see a lot of 50s generally. I say 48 is definitely what if you're trying to get a decent score on the quant, shoot for that 48 in terms of a strong score. So can you do the work? When I look at that, I think they might be, they'll definitely look at that transcript and see what shook out in the 3.28, and then what did you do, what went well for the rise to 3.7 in the final 2 years. How many times have you taken the GMAT?
I've taken it twice. I improved quite a bit, so it was like mid 550, something like that. I can't remember the first one, and then up to 710. So I was pretty happy with the result.
Awesome. Are you thinking of taking it again?
I'm pretty hesitant. It took me a good amount of time to reach 710, especially with a crazy busy job. But I'd be open to it if you think like it'll really open a lot of doors for me.
Yeah. So that'll bring me to your target programs. I'd say in a round one situation, 710, it would be a nice to have. I wouldn't say it's critical. I could see a potential situation where like a Cambridge waitlisted you, and that would be your total cue that they like you, but they want you to give it one more show. LBS, yeah, that's where I'd say, although again, you're coming from a demographic which underrepresented generally in terms of Canadians generally. So that'll help. You're looking at two awesome schools, big fan of Oxford and Cambridge, but not necessarily going to hold you to like having a 740 per se, or everyone applying. So I'd say if you feel like you're kind of tapped out at it, don't let that hurt your the application time. But I'd be open to it. Yeah. Partly because that GPA, if you had like a 3.6 or 7, I'd say they're going to be confident you can kind of handle the academic rigor, but that just from my gut, that might be something that's jumping out to them. Now, one note I had here was the extracurriculars, the mentoring, the starting the nonprofit, things like that. Are you formally doing some of that now, or is it more kind of informal?
No, so I've been doing it informally, and now I'm starting to go into the formal space. So partnering with universities now, and like it's really starting to pick up. Cool.
So this brings me to a point of creativity around extracurriculars. There are people that will say, well, should I now rush and do stuff? Should I get it, 7 months left or whatever? Think about, especially like, let's say, like Lay or someone who, let's say Lay can just develop an app like that for someone who has no idea how to, bring something to life. Be open to pro bono things for your friends, things where you could just on the weekend say in an essay, I'm helping out so-and-so with their fintech app because this is what I do every day at work. Or I have someone that has a green product idea, and I'm gonna just give my expertise and strategy around it. That's totally fine, because what you're doing there too is that's what school is all. That's what's going on in the classroom all the time. You're helping folks out who don't have the background you do. In an effort, when you apply to sort of say, hey, I'm a fit for your program, you want to also show that kind of unselfishness. So that can come out in the extracurriculars in ways that aren't formalized out. So that's kind of why I asked. Mentoring is always a great thing. Alex, one thing that jumps out, because it may not be apparent to people on the surface, but have you looked into Oxford, Cambridge, and LBS in terms of the fit with sort of green tech and ops consulting?
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, the reason that Oxford and Cambridge really jump off the page for me specifically is their social impact components. Yeah. So for me, like social entrepreneurship is really important, and it's something that I want to go into. In terms of operations consulting, I realize that may be a bit of a tougher fit from what I've seen, but I do know that at least some of the alumni that I've talked to have managed to find their way into those spaces. So it's not impossible, but it's just limited, it sounds like. Yeah.
I'd say too, when you looking at the deeper background on you before the call, one of my notes was, where is it? Yeah. So, in terms of the project engineering, that $10 million plus portfolio, that jumps out. That's a great resume piece. That's that again, tied it to business, gang. Keep thinking of what you're doing and how it ties to the overall business structure. If there is an operational component to it, you could argue you want to go into just strategy consulting focused on clean tech or green tech, and not go down, because what happens when you say operations consulting, you're competing with some serious, Six Sigma, like super deep operations folks that could have been coming from operations consulting already, but now want to go to BCG or Bain. So I don't want you to kind of get ahead of yourself in terms of where your sweet spot is. You can make the case for it, but you might want to be a little more open to something that's maybe a little bit more of a fit in terms of the past.
Sure.
But then in the long-term goal, again, green tech, obviously something that is going to be near and dear personally to you, and put that flag in the ground around some cause, something out there within the sector that just pains you or that you see a massive business opportunity with.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's completely in line with what I want to do. In terms of the operations consulting component, like genuinely, if it's just generic management consulting, like that is something that I would like to at least attempt. If it branches like sub into operations consulting, that makes sense. In terms of like Sigma belts, like I'm already becoming certified in Lean Six Sigma, so it's definitely, I think like I'm getting there, but I'm not quite there yet.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. I meant to bring that up, and that's they'll see your potential. It's more that as long as that short-term goal, you're showing sort of more of a riskless path to employment. That's a common phrase I use, gang, out there, but it's really critical that you're sort of showing them that who recruits from their schools. So let's say you look at the Green Tech Conference at LBS, you see who sponsors it. You're going to show them that get them comfortable, that who's aware. Because what the danger people say in the essays all the time is, I see myself going into operations consulting post Cambridge. That's kind of set up for rejection right there. Now, good point though. You're generally going to be a generalist first, more or less. There are some in any strategy consulting role after you can preference it in the essay. So if you're a nurse or a doctor, or you come from a healthcare background, go for it. But generally, you like a McKinsey per se, you're not going to slot into a sector right away.
Yeah.
The other thing too, I'll say on consulting is, for all those out there who might have consulting goals or just throwing it out there because they don't know what else to put, be mindful of you're competing potentially, if you've never done consulting, with people who are coming from consultancies. And I would say generally AdComs will give a preference to the people who already have consulting background. So just be aware of that. The other thing with consulting, especially when you're talking about the BCG, Bain, McKinsey world sort of platform or space, the GMAT, GRE kind of matters, because they know that those companies factor that into their recruiting sometimes. So if you've got like a 690 and your goal is to go to McKinsey, you might have all the other stuff to make that go, but they might be looking at you more from the test perspective. So just be conscious of that. But overall, Alex, I think, you've isolated the programs. I'd say, the fallbacks make sense. We haven't touched those. The London Imperial, I'd say generally you'd want to maybe have one or two more in there just to be safe. But with the 710, if you didn't take it again, it wouldn't be, I don't think, the end of the world in a round one situation.
John, just out of curiosity, do you think that there's, like, what would be the equivalent American schools that you think I would be a good fit for? I know that it's just not something I've looked into, but I'm genuinely curious if that's a avenue I've avoided and missed.
Yeah, I'd say it's interesting, because you could probably, you could probably make the case for a lot of different ones, because you're kind of, the social impact will be the dominant way to think about it, I'd say. So Kellogg, Wharton, Fuqua, Harvard, in terms of the net impact. Stanford, this is separate from test score profile stuff. Then you get into sort of like we were talking about before in terms of LA sort of clean tech. Ross would be another one in terms of energy. So you really you'd have plenty of options there, because it's one of those, it's kind of like insurtech or fintech. Schools are adapting to what's coming, or whether it's cyber or blockchain. So for those who are kind of trying to think of where to go, be mindful of the trends, because that will also affect the class profile. If there are industries that are just not recruiting, you bet they're not going to be taking a lot of folks into that are stating that in their essay. But I think for this call, like there's more I need to go into, but I'd say those schools would jump out. I think the social impact piece should be your slant and your sort of angle.
For sure.
It's
Thanks, John.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hope that was helpful. And of course, there'll be time for questions at the end. So, so lastly, in terms of the profiles, we've got Cap. Cap, thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, look, let's. So we've got energy again, a kind of a different angle. One thing that jumps out with Cap, which may not be apparent to everyone on the call, but Cap sort of has what I call a great shaping incident. So Cap, you talked about sort of, as a childhood, in your childhood around food and how that influenced your interest in energy and sort of the whole line there on out. That's really powerful. A lot of applicants I've worked with over the years have had something happen, not necessarily in childhood, but they've just been that something shaped their view on something in business or in a sector, and it sort of just carried them. So just off the bat, you're going to have a lot of credibility if, let's say, you continue with that, the strategy consultant goal within the space, the energy space. It doesn't sound cheap. Like some people will just throw out strategy consulting. You sort of have a lot of credibility around it. You're curious about the space, and that came out when I saw your notes. That says a lot. In terms of can you do the work? So we've got yet to take the GMAT, but the target around 740, 760.
Yep.
We've got the mechanical engineer 366. That's awesome. You transferred. Not a huge, for those of you transferred, not a big issue at all. They'll look at kind of where you did. They'll in the optional essay where there might be a place to sort of address why you transferred if there was a main reason. That would be important. I think the first in the family and extended family to graduate from college, great, but it can be common. So just be careful. You don't want to necessarily highlight that so much because it can be common, believe it or not. But nice to have and a nice to include. One thing with oil and gas services, that is, it's an area I'm seeing a lot of interest or activity in, whether people are coming from it or want to go into it. So you will see sort of competition around the strategy consulting goal there. The key then is sort of that, what is that leadership role? So my main note was, where do you see yourself ultimately going in the energy industry?
I actually want to first, like as mentioned in my notes, I want to go into strategy consulting and then take up corporate strategy roles within a big company to position how they view energy and how they can influence a broader community.
Yep. So
through their actions.
That's awesome. That fits. So corporate strategy, again, you're refining it. It fits with strategy consulting, as a lot of you know out there. Strategy consultants kind of set on a path to be a head of corporate strategy, and then maybe an eventual CEO, as we see with the alums of many of the top consultancies. One of the things on your resume that, or at least on the notes that I want to bring up, is sort of the product design piece, the technical engineering product design. And so in making sure you're tying that to potential revenue impact or whatever business metric kind of exists off of that, if you will. Mm-hmm. Because when you said like I design products for more, like that's a great headline number. But product design to admissions committee will be like, what does he mean? So you kind of want to unpack that a bit. Because product design sounds great, but it's kind of like, well, where in the business chain does it fit in and stuff. So one thing to remember for everyone is business ultimately, if we really had to simplify it, revenues, costs, process, people kind of thing. Those are kind of, there's much more, but that's in a simple way. So just if you're always looking to attach something, whether it's managing a process, changing a process, improving efficiencies, it's all tied to sort of that business sense. So I think your why is strong, and I think it's very credible. I'd say work experience, 4.5 years by the time you start, that's plenty. The target schools, so you've got some of the big names up there, of course. So I'd say your demographic wise, you're sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the pure kind of Indian demographic. But you'd still want to be, for Wharton Booth, I'd say you'd still want to be, try to hit that, 730 as a sort of a target. That's typically the score that if you're coming from a really overrepresented demographic, we would say you are competitive. You're sort of in the mix. You're not necessarily, you're kind of 50-50, but you're definitely going to get the look. That's not to say that below that doesn't happen, but that's just kind of what we've found over the 15 plus years or so of doing it. The other ones that you mentioned, so the UT Austin jumps out, and I like that a lot because of your goals. I would say I've seen more of an interest in increasing their interest in consultants and getting consultants on board. Obviously, the energy industry in Texas. There are, I'd say, of these schools, all of them place well in what you're looking to do, especially in the strategy consulting, the corporate strategy front. The key is to kind of hyper focus the energy piece and say, does Charlottesville, does Darden really give that to me? Or should I be looking at a Ross instead? And so just something that jumps out, because on the surface, these schools are great in terms of the consulting and corporate strategy, but when you get into the sector piece, you can start to kind of see where ones are sort of better than others.
Yeah. One of the reasons why, while having a bunch of people surrounding you with energy is great, I also wanted not everyone in my school to be surrounded with the energy experience, which is why I kind of went northern schools.
Yeah. So it's a smart point. It's something that people ask me about. And by the way, I want to talk about your podcast too, because that's something on the extracurriculars I want to bring up. You still do that, by the way?
It has taken a backseat,
Okay.
but I would like to get back into it after I'm done with the GMAT.
Yeah. So just a couple of things on that. So first on so the should I go if I'm a finance person, should I apply to a finance school? If I'm an energy person, I'd say schools don't want to necessarily now just be known for one thing. And I think that's over the past 10 years, there's definitely been a movement away from, oh, that's a finance school, to that is a strong general management school, and it just happens to do well in usually multiple spaces. So some people will say, well, should I try to game it and say, well, they're really probably trying to boost their fintech people. Should I apply there, even though they're kind of weaker in finance? I've never really seen a lot of way to really a substantive way to answer that. I'd say generally that schools need to have diverse classes, so they cannot just have all investment bankers. So Booth cannot just have tons of investment bankers. But the key is in looking at the dean interviews and really going not just onto the main page of these websites, but looking at what they're saying and what the curriculum, what changes are happening. Are they looking for more insurtech people? Doesn't mean you need to have to kind of finagle or force fit your essays, but just be conscious that these schools are really kind of branching out now and looking for diverse people in terms of backgrounds, of course, but also in terms of the goals. So, but I'd say, yeah, the test score will be critical for you. GPA is there, work experience is there, goals will be there, but the GPA is going to be kind of whether you kind of maintain that sort of core list or kind of want to kind of de-risk it a bit.
Gotcha.
But the key too, and this is another thing that came up with a couple of you guys, is you have right here Australia, Alaska, Norway. Anytime you can mention work with other countries or customers, or you don't have to physically have been in Norway, you don't have to physically have been in Shanghai, but just to be able to say that you have clients or vendors in the UK, and if you're in Indonesia, awesome. More so for an INSEAD and some of the European schools where international experience is almost like if you either have it and you're not getting in. But for US schools, that's really important. A lot of people take that for granted when they apply. So it's nice to see another thing that is a positive cap in your profile.
Gotcha. Can I ask you this one question?
Yeah.
Is there any other way that I, as an engineer, can demonstrate soft skills? I've been involved with Toastmasters, and I've been doing some volunteering activities where you talk to a bunch of people, but should it be more focused on your work experience? Can the soft skills part come from your extracurricular activities, and how much do you include?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say I wouldn't try to actively go seek out ways, in sort of training, you know what I mean? It doesn't really, it's better to sort of keep it to, and I go back to like what are the stories in your life that are not anything to do with engineering that have shaped where you're going and where you want to go. Toastmasters, I used to see a lot. I rarely see it anymore. I think it can kind of come out in your extracurricular work too. So people who are volunteering or mentoring or working with a different socioeconomic group, and they're really getting, they have to come converse with them every weekend in a way that they're just not used to in the workplace. There are other ways to signal those skills. And I think often it's almost like by not doing the more typical like Toastmasters or training of soft skills, but by showing it through examples in other pieces of your work or interactions, that's really the best way to do it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I hope, does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure, yes. And two more questions. You mentioned something, you were going to say something about my podcast. And lastly, how much of your sports can you include? I went from someone who was not able to run a mile to like completing a half marathon, and I'm training for a 150-mile bike ride. Nothing like an Ironman, but still. How do you tie that into your applications? If you have any insights on those.
Yeah, it's a common thing, and so a couple things. And unless you're a sports management, and you don't see many, but sports management folks that are kind of on that track, that's where they kind of use a lot of that evidence of their sports. Otherwise, it's sort of bottom of the resume, hobbies and interests, which are important. Don't get me wrong, and there's a lot of overlap that people have. I'd say it's, and I'll get to the podcast piece. It's much more of, if you formally have pushed, so if you climbed Everest 10 times, that's probably going to be your main essay story. So there are a lot of people who've done a lot of trekking, especially folks in that area of the world where, you have access to, Himalayas and things like that, which is fantastic. And it's something that is common to see in terms of marathons, Ironman, triathlons, whatever you want to call it, ultra distance stuff. I think it says a lot about, your discipline and your ability to juggle things, which is definitely what business school is a test on, is how much you can handle it all at once, because it's overwhelming. But really, unless you're kind of Olympic athlete or you've really done it at a level that is almost semi-pro, it's right. Kind of takes a background. It's enough to sit on the CV. That's all. And if you did 10 marathons, if I put those times down, like I'm all for, and I did a graduation at Fuqua. I spoke to the class during graduation, and my topic was about how the stuff at the bottom of our resume can actually make us much more intriguing employees and colleagues and people for our clients. That can actually help generate business. That's sort of, the talk on when you walk in each day and what you did on the weekend. So I never de-emphasize that stuff. I just say that there are levels of it. But I think the weight loss stories, I see tons of those. Again, not to lower the priority of and the power of it, but I see a lot of them because you got to remember, everyone applying to these schools tends to sort of have a lot of impressive things occur in their life and a lot of trauma and or resilience. So if anyone out there has had a lot of points where you don't want to come across as perfect when you apply, guys. You want to show vulnerability and what you learn. They're all about what you learn from the low points, from the time where you were some X kilos and you had to drop. That's what they're trying to get into. Your composition, not your physical composition, but your mental, what your mental fortitude. So I'm a big believer in going for that stuff and really trying to weave it in if there's a place. And then on the podcast, for anyone out there that does things on the side, websites, art, music, podcasts, maybe it's not public, you have to be careful with work, whatever it may be, just to the extent you can share that, that's, to use the cliche, that's thought leadership. Schools love that stuff. And it just sort of says that you're not just the worker bee every day, that you care about some topics. So let's say with Alex, with Green Tech or with Social Impact, if he has some blog that he does on the side that he can reference in the resume, that sort of adds a lot of credibility. So,
thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. And with that, I think we're going to turn to questions. And I hope this has been helpful thus far, and I'll dive into a bunch of questions here. Let's see. We're just waiting. Here we go. Okay, so we got a question on extracurriculars from Sidhant. We mentioned that in the resume, and what if, and do not, if we don't have any extracurricular activities. So let me answer the first one. Yeah, it's going to come up in, typically it'll be like a volunteer and leadership section on the resume or CV. So you want to include, but again, if you have stuff going back to high school or uni or like way long ago, you really have to be careful, because in a typical full-time MBA application, your resume and CV is going to be one page. Unless you're executive MBA and you're like 35 or older, let's say, generally, you're not going to have a 2-pager. So there are rare circumstances, but they're going to expect a 1-page. So you can't overload it too much. Now, remember, on the online application, there are areas to put that into. There's usually like a list of 5, I think, dialogue boxes at least for some schools. If you don't have any extracurriculars, I wouldn't rush out. I would try to do something between now and then. I wouldn't though. And maybe it's something at work, but they're going to be looking for you to have done something for some length of time outside of work or through a work affiliated program that is not your day-to-day core function. So if you have to rush out or do something now, then so be it. But I try to avoid it. Another question. Let's see here. We've got
John. Actually, I had a question for you, if that's
yeah.
all right. Just a question about GPAs. It sounds like the other 2 candidates here are like have really impressive profiles, and guys, kudos to you. But just out of curiosity, in terms of placement in your program, so once you know what your ranking is relative to your program, does that make a difference? Like if I'm sitting in the top 15%, but I have a 3.3,
yeah.
Like, does that make a difference? Like, should that be highlighted? Because it makes a difference to me, but I don't know if it makes a difference to anyone else.
Yeah, Alex, that's a great question. And this has come up a lot last cycle with a couple of folks I was working with, where Indian clients, where, you know, they're basically everyone in the class, you know, more or less got hit pretty hard in terms of, you know, a couple of courses that everyone was taking. So it wasn't an apples to apples comparison, kind of like you're saying. So yeah, they do look at that. That is the core reason why the schools will often ask for class rank. And it's not to sort of say, you know, who's number one and who's not. That has nothing to do with it. It's all about, we've got to normalize, you know, statistically, we've got to find some way to compare these two. And again, like I started with a 2.5 out of 4. I got to 3.3. That's kind of what, and as everyone knows here, turning your GPA around over 4 years is hard. It takes, you really got to have a bunch of semesters where you're just, you know, whatever A's or whatever the metric is. So trajectory is key. I will say this to everyone out there: the GPA, I've noticed over the past like 2 years, or let's say 1 to 2 cycles, has for some reason become a little bit more emphasized, regardless of how long you've been out from university. So I don't know why that is. I don't see necessarily the rationale. If you're 27 and you, let's say you had a 3.1, and then you go to Google and you're like a product manager, I mean, you've kind of, I think, proven yourself in terms of the workplace. So, but it just to note, everyone out there, that it is something I'm seeing a little bit more of an emphasis on. I'd say that doesn't mean the test score has to be a certain points higher. It's just that they're going to want to know what's going on there. And if you, it's better to come like an optional essay. If you do, typically what we recommend is if you have it below a 3.0 on the 4.0 scale, and schools know, if you're coming from a non 4.0, like let's say India or China, let's say schools know the whole education system, they know how to sort of compare. But that's sort of the metric where you want to write an optional essay and say, look, this is what happened. And I've seen it all. I've seen mental health issues, you know, a lot of issues that people have had that just took them astray for a bit. You know, we're human. So, so let me ask another question. Thanks for bringing it up. You know, is age 28 too old for full time? No, that's a good question, Gajin. Not at all. I'd say entering at 28 is fine. I wouldn't push it for full time, at least in the U.S. Much above that. European schools are much more kind of liberal, kind of open about age. So I've definitely seen people go full-time to top MBA programs in Europe who are, you know, well into their 30s. US schools just tend to be a little bit more on that 30 or below. This is roughly. And then oh yeah, good question from Vay. Could you explain how one can select his or her target MBA programs? This is great. So in a nutshell, I keep talking about goals and the why and the anchor, because when you apply to business school, you have to prove that you need the degree. You know, you don't want to get in a situation where they're like, well, they can just laterally go to Apple or, you know, Schlumberger or Exxon. No, they can just laterally go to McKinsey. You want to say, look, I'm missing this stuff. And hey, Booth or Tuck, you are ideally suited to give me that stuff. So the target programs is really, you kind of work in reverse. You have your goals, and then you're thinking, take out geography, cost, let's say cost is more or less going to be the same. You don't know if you might get a merit scholarship. It all comes down to what curriculum, what courses, what professors give you an opportunity to match well with that, to getting that next gig. So I wouldn't throw darts at all the M7s and all the top 10 out there around the world. They know a lot of you guys and girls are doing that. You have to show authenticity. Put yourself on campus. If you think about a courtroom or when a prosecutor is trying to put someone at the scene of a crime, you know, the convinced jury, they're trying to put that person there and get in their heads. It's kind of similar thing. We're trying to put you in Philadelphia at Wharton or put you in London at LBS or Imperial. That separates the good applicants from like the ones that are just copying and pasting from the site, you know, and the marketing speak, as we call it. So show some sincerity, talk to alums, that kind of stuff. You will self-select schools. You'll get rid of schools just through conversations alone. You'll figure out, hey, this is not a cultural fit. Here's a question. What if I don't have any experience and I want to pursue an MBA as a BSc physics graduate? So there, Sabda, you'd be really looking at maybe the deferred MBA program. So for those who don't know, you know, Wharton, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, a bunch of the schools have deferred programs. So you apply while you're in university, and then you defer, you know, matriculars start until you've worked for like a couple years. So that would be the fit there. So that's, yeah, as you see, there's how, yeah, the 2+2. So thanks there, Abhijit. Another question. Let's see. Oh yeah. So one sec. I'm just going through the list. These are all good. Let's see. Well, I don't see any right now. One other thing I'll just bring up that we kind of, you know, talked on is the essay. I just want to talk about the essays because the essays are they are very important. They are one piece. Don't forget. Your essays really need to show things. So you can tell them all you want that you love net impact or that you love developing apps and that you love working in Tableau. You need to show them. And so the key thinking is, for example, when in doubt in your essays or even in an interview, when you're just kind of, you find yourself telling them things, say, for example, when I was working with my friend on a Sunday on the FinTech app, I learned that I really was into give the visual. It's like cinematography. You want to take them into a scene in your life, as opposed to telling them how great you are. The resume tells the story. You need to sort of show the actual scenes. Because the resume, what they do with the resume is they look at it and they're like, okay, he or she wants to go to Apple. Okay, they're coming from investment banking. That's going to be a jump. They're risky. Oh, they're a software developer at Credit Suisse and they want to go to Apple. We could probably make that work. Okay, that's what they're doing in the initial scan, aside from the test score and all that stuff. So your resume sort of suggests to them confidence that you kind of know where your goals are and how you're a fit. Then there's that sort of, and you admit things. Hey, I'm really weak in these areas. Soft skills, let's say with CAP or whatever, or more improvement there, that kind of thing. So you want to look at the essays as your time to really show them who you are. And you don't want to tell them you're empathetic. You want to talk about the volunteering you've done, the mentoring you've done. Get personal, you know, create emotion. That's what gets them to say, let's give him or her the interview. Because your goal really for let's say Kellogg or side or schools where, you know, Kellogg tends to give, I think, a lot of interviews, or let's say Duke, where you can kind of choose a window and choose an interview. But most schools, your goal is to really get an interview. Because if you can get the interview, you can kind of bring yourself to life, and that's kind of the step to get in. Really, I always view. You want to look at the interview. The other thing on the resume is impact. So be thinking about when you're thinking about your profiles. You know, don't get too in the weeds. Don't get too in details that they'll have no idea. So don't use acronyms from your work that the admissions committee won't know. You kind of have to dumb the resume down a bit because they're not necessarily, you know, they don't necessarily know the technical words that you just take for granted every day. Because the worst thing can happen is submit a resume as part of your profile for CV and that you totally get it and your recommenders totally get it, but that they're kind of like, what does she really do? And on recommendations, you know, we haven't talked about that for the purposes of the profile evaluation, but I want to bring that up because I imagine it kind of weighs in people's minds. And there's another question I'll answer from Karan, but before we end, but you want people who can write about you in detail. This is not about a president or a prime minister or a head partner at McKinsey or wherever, that just because they have a title. That kind of works in uni when, you know, maybe donors and things like that to the school. This is all about, have they seen you function? And are you differentiated from all the other people applying to LBS or Wharton or Nanyang? You want to show that you're an outlier. They want to show that you're an outlier within your peer group. And there's always that question of, how does he or she compare to others? Or it's the benchmarking piece of that question with your strengths. And everyone, most recommenders on their first pass just totally blow through that part. They just talk about how great you are. I mean, every recommendation letter by definition is laudatory. It's praiseworthy. So the best ones are the ones who are like, oh, they're great at this, but this is why. This is how they're different than other analysts or associates. And so Karan has a great question. Is it possible to get into a good school with a 2.7 GPA, computer science, but with a 720 GMAT? That is a good question. And I've seen this before. Not necessarily a 2.7, but you know, basically just below 3.0. I'd say I'd say in my years doing this, I'd say the answer would be a yes. It's not a it depends on the school. It depends what happened for that 2.7, what the composition was. But I'd say if you had a 740 GMAT and you have a 2.7, and you can explain it well in an optional essay, that would give me even more comfort. But I'd say you'd get a look, but the reasoning behind the 2.7 is going to be the key thing. If it's that you took on too much responsibility, blah, 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 or you got overwhelmed, like a lot of people will say, that might not be good enough. But if it was something where you had to take time off from school, which I've seen, people who had physical health issues, I've seen a lot, that might weigh into it. But it's not going to be easy, but I'm very optimistic. I had a 610 for my GMAT gang and a 510 and a 580 for my total scores. So there's hope out there for anyone that doesn't have a lot of the numbers. But I made the case for other things, and I had a lot of leadership and stuff. And so one other question I'll take, Emily, what is an example of a good person to write a letter of recommendation outside of a work manager? Yeah, great question, Emily. So generally, these schools are going to prefer that one of them be a direct manager or a boss or supervisor. It's a preference. It's not a red flag if you guys don't use that person. In an optional essay, you'll just want to explain why. So often it's like, hey, I can't let them know I'm leaving work. Totally fine. You're not going to get dinged. It's just, that's a preference. If you can't use someone that's outside of work manager, I'd say someone from an extracurricular. Usually you can't use, they will say no professors, no like old prior professors or academic stuff. So I've seen clients, so especially consultants will use clients, extracurricular, a board, a nonprofit leader, executive director, or something like that. A mentor who might have sold a business that doesn't work anymore, had a liquidity event, that kind of gig. But there you can be open, be flexible with it, except the academic, the professor stuff.
John, I have one last question, if you are willing. Yeah. Is it advisable to
if GMAT Club lets you, I'm always willing. Oh yeah.
Is it advisable to change jobs, considering that you are going to be applying for business school in about 4 months for personal reasons? And if so, what are some things to consider?
Yeah, I'm glad we're taking this question. Awesome question. This just came up on a consultation I did last week. It's come up a lot. People are kind of like, they're trying to, kind of get closer because they figured out the goals are so important. So they're like, well, maybe I should do this job now to start up to. In this time, I'd say you don't want a resume that's all, 7 different places in 8 years. I've worked with a couple people over the years on that, consultant to service, consultant to client, back to consultant, back to client. I'd say don't do it at this point. I'd say they like kind of trajectory. So for all of you, and we didn't talk about it, but all 4 of the profiles today, for everyone out there, there are a lot of promotions that I didn't really touch on in detail, but a lot of you have been promoted twice, 3 times. That's what they care about. So what happens is when you suddenly go leave now and you're at a new place, it might be closer to your goals or better, prepare you, but how much can you really get done in this short amount of time? They're fully aware of that. So I'd say unless you're about to get laid off or something like that's going on, and you're kind of preempting that, fine. But otherwise, stick with where you are. I think it's better to have a smoother trajectory and see if you can take on more of a leadership or more responsibility.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, with that, I think, Abhijit, is that, anything else I can answer? Any other questions for anyone? It's like, I don't see any. Okay. Well, with that, if there are no other questions, anyone from the panel, anyone else? Lay, Alex, PMP, Cap, thank you guys both for joining and being willing to do this. I really enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful for not only you all, but as you can all see out there, everyone listening and watching, there's a lot to be taken from this. So
I think you answered all the questions. Thank you.